Good morning. Yesterday I was remembering a quote, something about every bush was on fire. So I Googled it and I came across the actual quote by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I had thought that, well, she must be like a theologian or something like that. And it turns out that's not the case at all. But the quote that I remembered, and now I actually read what it all said, it says, "Earth is crammed with heaven. Every common bush on fire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries." And I think when it comes to faith, that's a little bit of how it is. It's like we have a sense of God, we know it, and we have this deep reverence once we really comprehend it. But we're also surrounded by people who don't get it at all. And I find that just kind of an enlightening little quote that kind of keeps me in perspective that, oh yeah, some of us get to see it, and it's a real privilege and a gift. So this Elizabeth Barrett Browning caught my attention. I didn't know much about her at all. And she was born in 1806 into a wealthy family. The family, all the way back into the 1600s, now there's a couple hundred years, had established plantations in Jamaica, and with slaves and all the rest had an incredibly profitable business making sugar or whatever they do down there. And he decided to raise his family though in England, so he moves. She is brought up in England, and she is the oldest of 12, 8 brothers and 3 sisters. So it's a big family. But as the oldest, she does all the things that a country girl in the 1800s of some wealth would do. But every time she got a chance, she got away from all of that and went into reading books and writing. And she started writing poetry at the age of 11. Isn't that fascinating? 11 years old, and here she's writing this poetry, and her mom kept some of this, so they still have it. And then at the age of 15, she got really sick. I'm not sure exactly what the sickness was, but as a result of that, she suffered from headaches and spinal back pain the rest of her life. So she goes on and becomes this poet and becomes kind of famous. One of her most famous poems is, and you might know, have heard this, "How do I love thee?" I'll just give you the beginning of it. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love these to the depth, breadth, and height my soul can reach. When feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal, grace, I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and by candlelight." And on it goes. She just was a gifted poet, but wrote tremendous amounts. So in her day, it was the 1850s, whatever, she was considered one of the greatest poets alive at that time. But anyway, she writes this book of poems that gets released in 1844. And this other writer, Robert Browning, reads this and gets really interested and excited about it, starts corresponding with her, meets her, and they actually end up having a courtship and falling in love. However, her father, somehow it's known that this wouldn't be okay, so they do all that in secret. She even gets married in secret, and when he finds out, he does disinherit her, so she gets nothing out of the whole deal. But it was a really fascinating love story. To think that a lot of it was through correspondence. And when I was a kid, my mom and dad had written during the war. And so when we were kids, we would go up in the attic and read some of these love letters that my dad had written, because he had this really fancy writing. So it just kind of brought me back to that, which is kind of a cool place to be. But she was not an educated theologian of any sort, and she's a writer. Her most famous one, Aurora Lie, is a series of about 8 or 9 books, and the story just continues from one to the next, and they were just fascinating story. But in her zeal of Christian insight, she wrote this. She said, "We want the sense of the saturation of Christ's blood upon the souls of our poets, that it might cry out through them." Isn't that fascinating? It's like she understood something of Christ and put it into her writings. It didn't have to be all educated or anything else about it, but somehow when you know, you get this flow that just kind of comes through, and it's just so well. So I end, and I think, and she only lived till 55, so she got married when she was 40, so when they finally got that all figured out, she was 40 years old. So if she lived, they only were married 15 years. And yet he was very much responsible, Robert Browning, for getting a lot of her work published after she had died. And I come back to, again, to that a sense of God's always there, God's always around, which is like some of the major theology. I think of Brother Lawrence. He had this thing where he just always believed he was in the presence of God. Well, listen to the poem again. Earth crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God's love. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. Have a good day.